Hey guys, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. On today's semi-scientific gear shootout, we're going to be examining what I think is one of the more overlooked parts of a guitar signal chain, and that is the power amp. It's kind of funny considering the power amp puts the amplifier in the phrase guitar amplifier, but I feel for a lot of especially direct recorded tones, and even when we're talking about, high gain amps like this, people just tend to gloss over that section entirely since, we are getting the distortion, most of the tone from the preamp section alone. That's ultimately made me wonder, with all else equal, does it really matter what kind of power amp you use? Does it matter if you're using EL34 tubes or 6L6s or no tubes whatsoever? So I decided, yeah, let's do that. Let's see if it actually matters or not. And to keep all else variables equal, we're going to be using the same overdriven preamp sound. So you're going to be hearing the preamp of a single rectifier, Series 1, driven by a Fort and Grind pedal. This is kind of a ubiquitous sound at this point. I think most of you that's been around the channel a time or two have heard this exact kind of recorded guitar tone, so you'll be able to have an ear for just how much it's being affected through all the different repetitions. And then for the cabinet microphone section, we'll be using the same mic'd up Mesa oversized 4x12 rectifier cabinet with an off-axis SM57. For this sort of test, I'm really not going after the best metal guitar tone in the world. I'm using this setup for a couple of reasons, one of which is with only one microphone, I don't have to worry about screwing up and, accidentally tripping over a second microphone cord. If I were recording and, for normal purposes, I would almost always blend in a second microphone. But with the SM57, it does have another advantage in that it is a dynamic mic, meaning that it has a lot of headroom. You can blast this thing with a lot of volume and it can still handle it. So with that, I actually just set the preamp of my Scarlett interface to the 12 o'clock noon position for the microphone, and then just crank the volume until I got a similar peaking level on all the power amp setups. With this, all of the peaks are actually within 0.3 decibels, meaning that the loudest sample and the quietest sample are basically indiscernible in terms of volume by the human ear. And frankly, the difference between 0 and 0.3 decibels of difference on a regular power amp volume control is just, it's absurd how little it is. You can sneeze on that control and get like a decibel difference pretty easily. So it took a while to do these tests, to get them all lined out, but I'm pretty happy with the results. And before we get into the rest of the setup or reveal our contestants, I'll let you hear the raw recordings. And of course you guys can, take your bets or pick your favorites, whatever you usually do in this blind spot. I have no idea. But anyway, here they are. Before I get started with reveals, I should state that this isn't going to be a great litmus test for all guitar tones. This is specifically a high gain amp sound through recording volume power amp sounds. We're not really in the level of distortion or power tube breakup that you would find on, say, a 15-watt combo amp that relies solely on the power amp section to get its tone and its distortion. They're going to behave differently, and the sound is very, drastically different than what you're going to hear out of these tests. So this is really for those of you that are recording or gigging with high gain amps. This does not represent everything. This is merely a vertical slice of what you can encounter. Let's get obvious contestant number 1 out of the way with the Cherrytone Gargoyle. This is the newest hot rod plexi from Cherrytone Amplification, and this was used with the effects return in the same manner that a band like Metallica would have used these amps to slave their Mesa Boogie Mark amplifiers through on like Master of Puppets, Justice for All, the Black Album, to get that sort of British power amp sound and drive more speaker cabinets. Now there's something interesting with this amp. First of all, it is a typical kind of British Class AB affair, which is good because it'll be comparable to some of the other amplifiers used in this shootout, but it does use EL34 power tubes, so it does represent that flavor. But with this amp, the master volume control actually doesn't do anything when you use it as as an effects return slave power amp. So basically the settings are exactly as you see here. When you turn the power on, it's getting juice at all times. But as you might imagine, even feeding this amp something like a -6 decibel peak line level piece of gear, it's loud, too loud for most things. So I ended up using this kind of the benchmark for the rest of the amplifiers to set the level. So when you see the B-roll of this with the master volume control set to 0, that's not a mistake. That's actually how the amplifier was running. For a sort of American analog to this amp, obviously, we're using the Mesa single rectifier also as a slave amp, and this was set on the lead channel with the modern voicing, so you are getting a little bit more of the high frequency content compared to the vintage voicing. I think that comes out in the tests. What makes this an interesting matchup with the Gargoyle is that it's also a 50 watt power amp using a single pair of power tubes, though it's 606 in this case, considering it's an American design. But with like all other things in this test, this isn't necessarily a representation of all 50 watt 6L6 driven power amps. This is merely this one. Though I think given kind of the results of this test, you'll be able to draw some conclusions, but not all 6L6s are created equally. Not all EL34s are created equally. Not all power amps with EL34 sound the same. So, kind of take everything with a grain of salt. Also from the Mesa camp, we have the Boogie Mark IV, which in the way I've set it is another 50 watt 6L6 driven power amp, except in Class A, not Class AB like the aforementioned amps here. So I've set the pentode triode switch still to pentode, the simulclass switch back to Class A, and the power switch at full power, which makes it a 50 watt Class A amp. This mirrors the power tube configuration you might find on vintage combo amps, and still being rated 50 watts, it provides a bit more of a direct comparison with the single rectifier power amp, though there's obviously going to be a voicing difference. Still should be rather interesting. Here's where things get a little nutty. Up next we have the Marshall MG 250 DFX. This is a solid state combo amplifier, and though the name might suggest this is a 250 watt amp, it's actually two 50 watt amplifiers provided you're driving an 8 ohm load, which in this case we are. So we get another decent point of comparison where we have a solid state amp at the same wattage, as well as being a Class AB. As far as I can tell, there's not a whole lot of documentation on it, but given its setup and sound comparison to the cheaper, often smaller Class D amplifiers you'd find in smaller combo amps and even pedals at this point, I'm fairly confident it's an AB, though definitely correct me down in the comments if I'm wrong there. And to round it all out, we have the Matrix GT1000 solid state Class AB power amp, and this is definitely the wild card of the bunch. First of all, it's rated at 1000 watts, provided that you use the proper mono bridged setup into the load that will result in that 1000 watt rating. But this is actually not meant to be used in the way that I'm using it. This is either meant for fractal audio devices, which in their firmware already model a tube power amp sound, and this is just kind of driving your speakers, or using a direct sound from a tube head like the direct line output or slave output from one of these amp heads to act as kind of your wet, dry, wet power amp rig. And I have a video on that if you're interested. But this isn't really meant to replace a power amp sound from a traditional combo or tube head. So that's why I was really interested to hear how it would stack up in a kind of unsanctioned use case. So with that, let's get this thing rolling. The results of this shootout left so many more questions than answers for me that I actually had to add another 50% or so of length to this video to kind of sanity check myself, because I went into this video with this preconception that tube power amp good, solid state bad, doesn't matter. That's end of the story. And with what I've heard, not necessarily, at least with, you know, what we're talking about here with a high gain amplifier through pretty loud recording setup, but, you know, something that if you were screaming at each other in the same room, you could hold a conversation, but, you know, obviously not at a regular talking volume. So keep that in mind as I discuss these results. But the first thing I wasn't terribly surprised about was the gargoyle and rectifier really didn't sound that different. The way I had the voicing set up on the rectifier, you have some more high-end frequency content, kind of pushes the presence, I think knocks back some of the negative feedback in the power section to achieve that. But certainly if I had done a little bit more tweaking to the presence controls, and even especially with some post EQ work, and lopped off a lot of the frequency content that you normally would in a recording, remember you're hearing the full frequency spectrum here, then I think these two would be practically indistinguishable. And this is something that, you know, I didn't even take advantage of the depth of presence controls on this to bring it more in line, which in the real world you absolutely could. So at least between these two, it's pretty much, I think, a safe bet to say that the whole EL34, 606, KT88 thing, it really doesn't matter at this volume in a 50 watt or especially 100 watt amplifier. We're simply not hitting the tubes hard enough for it to make a huge difference. Is there going to be some difference? Yeah, sure. There's going to be an overall texture voicing to the sound, and you can hear that if you go and say like a Fractal Audio, either AXFX or AX8, and you know, you change the power tubes, there's going to be a slight discernible difference. But in a blind shootout, or if you change it in the middle of a mix, no one's going to notice. I can really say it doesn't matter all that much. Now we move on to the Class A amp with the Mark IV. The first thing you'll notice is it's definitely the darkest of the bunch. Doesn't have nearly as much high frequency content. Again, that's something that I can't pin on being the fault of, you know, the amp design itself or it being Class A. It's just the kind of the way it came out in the wash. Whatever the root cause, I can say for sure that the attack and decay were really affected much more than between the two previous amplifiers, to where it almost sounded like I was playing through a lower gain pedal or amp. It's like I took the Fort and Grind pedal and went from, say, 3 o'clock to noon. It was that substantial, and you can almost see it in the raw waveforms, where the notes will be a little bit more compressed versus the fatter, more drawn out, more resonating notes with the other power amps. So again, I'm no expert or even understand all the nuances between Class AB and Class A, so I can't say that's exactly the reason, but I'd really be interested to know if that is something that that is widespread across all Class A power amps, and maybe that's the reason I like to use Class A power amps on, you know, lower gain clean stuff. With those slight differences in mind, they all still sounded like a rectifier. You know, you could have taken any of these power amps, recorded with them, or used them on stage, and it's not like people will be like, oh, what's that amp? No, it still sounds like a rectifier, just with a slightly different flavor in, you know, those critical power amp frequencies. So, you know, I think that really speaks to the importance of a preamp, obviously, how much dominance that has over the guitar tone, and especially the speaker cabinet and the microphone. And when using a tube amp, I mean, even between a Class A and Class AB, there are differences, as we've heard, but I don't think it's really as big as maybe some people have it in their heads to be in, you know, a distorted recording guitar case. Now, when we move on to the solid state stuff, I thought there would be a much bigger difference than there was, but honestly, if no one had told me, I don't think I'd been able to tell. I honestly don't think I would have gone, oh, well, that's obviously a solid state amp. They are flatter, don't get me wrong, but in the case of like the Marshall MG amp, it's voiced almost in a way that, you know, flipping between this and the Gargoyle, I was really hard pressed to tell a difference. I could hear a difference, but pinpointing what it was, kind of difficult, because in the Marshall MG, you can kind of hear, you know, a bump in that lower resonance frequency, kind of hear some bright top end. And even with the Matrix, you know, it's a flat solid state amp that's meant for stuff like fractal audio devices that already have, you know, that power amp modeling built in. So that makes sense that it would sit flatter because it's expecting that, you know, articulated frequencies coming in. But it still sounded okay, which was surprising to me. It speaks to a couple of things, I think. Number one being Class AB. It does interact with the speakers a bit more in the way that you might expect a tube head to do, which I think is why these are so well reviewed, and certainly I love mine. But, you know, I went in this thinking, well, these are going to be unusable. You know, this is going to sound laughably bad. And not really. Frankly, I think I could have either done some post EQ work, or especially put a power amp simulation plug-in over top of that, and I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So that got me thinking, you know, I always had this preconception that the tube power amp was really the be-all, end-all of sound because of my experience with direct recording and using, you know, VST plugins and stuff like the AX8. So I said, you know what, I've got to find this out for myself. Let's see how much the power amp plays into the guitar tone when you do a direct recording application. So what I did was capture an impulse response of that setup, same microphone, cabinet combination, same position, didn't move anything. I used the Matrix power amp to drive it all, capture the IR, and then I'll let you listen to a few more recordings and see which one you think is best, and I'll tell you what was what. So one of those recordings was simply the impulse response only. I literally fed the effect send from that single rectifier into my interface and job done. That's it. And that mirrors what a lot of people do with plugins especially, or like say you got these desktop tube preamps that are meant for, you know, kind of direct recording that don't necessarily use a power amp sound. That's kind of what that'll sound like. The second thing is I took that same recording but then applied a power amp simulation over it using the Ignite Amps TPA1 plugin. And this kind of spices it up in a way that I like. It includes a lot of like sagging and resonance and depth and presence options that make it sound more like a tube power amp the way you would expect. And then the other recording was the single rec, you know, fully as a head going through a load box, in this case the Torpedo Captor, 8-ohm load box, and then that raw signal feeding into the impulse response. So you're getting the baked in power amp sound from the amp head itself whereas the other cases either weren't using it at all or using a VST imitation of it. So here's who is who. This is kind of what I was expecting to hear last time, where the tube power amp setup sounded so much better than the raw preamp through the impulse response. Even the VST plugin of it sounded damn near identical to the way that I set up the rectifier itself. And this is why I harp on all the time using some sort of power amp simulation if you're using, say, a preamp pedal or a preamp plugin that doesn't use a power amp when recording direct tones, because they are super obvious, whether you're using something like a Moore micro preamp. I always recommend turning on the power amp simulation on the Moore radar if you're using that. With this, there's plenty of freeware out there that doesn't have a power amp sim on it. This is a great pairing for that, and as you can hear, it turns an otherwise flat kind of pod-like guitar sound into something that's really believable. And that is exactly why a lot of these older modelers just sound abysmal when used direct, and why they really come to life when you put them through the effects return of something like a tube power amp or even a solid state power amp. And that kind of gave me a revelation. It's not a tube versus solid state power amp question. It's, do you have a power amp? Because with this, there's no power amp at all. There's no push-pull, there's no class A/B, there's nothing happening. It is an unrealistic setup. In the impulse response only test, that would be like taking the effects send of a guitar amp head and plugging it straight into the cabinet, and assuming you had enough power at all to hear the damn thing, which if you do, it's going to be very quiet, then that's what you would get. And that's, there's no interaction going on whatsoever. There's no push-pull, there's nothing. And that's why, I don't know why I had this misconception that a solid state power amp is the same as not having one at all, because obviously it's not, and that's why it sounds great, and why you can kind of get that same sort of traditional amp feel with a quality modeler through a solid state power amp. Now, those of you with discerning ears might hear that and think, well, these recordings didn't sound the same as the first batch, and you would be right. If you listen to the impulse response versus the raw cabinet, it's missing a lot of low mids and not really taking the highs in the same way. I think I figured it out, and I don't know why this didn't really come to me sooner. A lot of companies use neutral tube power amps like Ownhammer to create their impulse responses, and it kind of bakes in that overall shape, the resonance you'd expect out of a tube power amp. I always shoot mine with the Matrix, which is another neutral power amp, but it's solid state. It doesn't necessarily react in the same way as you've heard on the recording. So I've always just fed it with something with a tube color, tube sound, and get a workable sound out of it. But I actually had to tone match the IRs with Curve EQ from Voxengo to get it to sound the same. And it kind of creates a curve that, it makes sense. That looks like a power amp resonance curve almost. You get the same sort of bump around 90-ish hertz in this case, and the same kind of bump in the mids and high mids. So even capturing an impulse response with a solid state power amp doesn't quite do it. So really, I guess what I've learned with this video as a whole is that there's kind of two parts to a tube power amp. It's the baked in color, the baked in sound you get, which you can definitely cheat by using something like a reactive load box. But you also have this baked in color when you actually pair the power amp with a speaker cabinet that you can't really fake with a solid state amp. So I think for a lot of people, this video is going to be information overload, because it kind of was for me, and I'm the one that did the damn test. For a lot of the stuff, like the direct tones, everything kind of fell into place logically and affirmed what, you know, I kind of understood from my past experience. But really, I didn't appreciate just the nuances with how a power amp interacts with a speaker cabinet in the physical realm. So I guess the important things to take away, number one, if you're using a traditional tube-based half stack, or it doesn't matter, just any speaker cabinet, you're going to mic it up to record it, or you're going to mic it up to gig with, the most important thing about the power amp section is that you have one. That's pretty much it. Because, I mean, I didn't shoot out the Moore Baby Bomb in this test specifically, but I've used it a million times in the past, and with a power amp sound in front of it, it sounds great. And it's a little, you know, dainty Class D thing at 30 watts. Is it going to stack up to something like the 1000 watt Matrix power amps? No, probably not. But I wouldn't have a problem getting with that at all. And a decent, and you know, this is a low bar for what I'm calling decent solid state power amp. If you know the Marshall MG series qualifies as decent, you can get by obviously with a lot. So you know, if you want to record through a real cab, just have something, and you can always tweak it afterwards, you know, or if you can send, say, a VST plugin. You know, I could pull up, let's say, the Fortin Nameless or the NTS, and if you want to record through a, you know, a real cabinet and get your own kind of flavor of sound, just disable this, see what it sounds like through a solid state amp, and if it works, awesome. If you need a little bit more tube life to it, then you can always throw on TPA or, you know, change some of the EQ parameters. It really kind of is that forgiving, which I was surprised about. For those of you that are recording or playing in a direct application, then a power amp sound is a must, whether you're using an onboard sim on another amplifier plugin, or if it doesn't have one, or if you're simply not happy with it, definitely check this one out. I'll have that link in the description, because you can turn something that sounds like a vintage, not very nice digital modeler sound into something that's very convincing, all just because you're bumping some frequencies. And you know, you can do some cool stuff here with like the sag and how hot the tubes are biased, and change the tube type. Pretty powerful plugin in that regards. So definitely give that one a spin if you're in VST land. And then for the impulse response creation side of it, I guess I need a tube power amp to do that. Or at the very least, I need to check out an article I've read one time, see if I can find it. I'll link it here as well. But I seem to remember, I think it was Own Hammer, I could be wrong, but someone saying that if you do use a regular solid state neutral power amp to capture IRs, that you'll have to bump certain frequencies, and that it will end up looking like this curve we made. It's definitely cool to see when that kind of stuff all comes together. So, man, what a video this turns out to be. Don't be surprised if the next shootout takes a while to get to. But if you do have any ideas on those, let me know what you'd like to see. I definitely try to get to it if I've got the equipment around. And any questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to power amps and all the intricacies that we discussed here, but if I don't know, I'll try to point you towards someone that hopefully does. So yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.